Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning. Ooh, microphone is hot there. I need to turn that down just a little bit. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning, and welcome to the very first Web 214 social media live stream. We'll be having these on Wednesday mornings throughout the remainder of the semester, unless otherwise noted. There will be some weeks in there where we will not have a live stream, and we'll have to do some things a little bit differently. But I'll let you know about those as we approach them. So let's talk for just a few minutes about some announcements here, because we did not get to meet last time, or last week when we were still doing some initial things. Essentially what had happened last week was I had already told another class that we were going to have a live session on Wednesday morning before I'd kind of finalized my streaming schedule, and now we have, I had to kind of readjust it just a little bit. But since I already had some people expecting it last week, we would have had one last Wednesday with the exception of that. So now every Wednesday forward, we'll be having one. So my apologies there for not getting us started right away, although I hope we're kind of easing into things well. Haven't received very many questions about things. I wanted to talk for a few minutes this morning before we got into the material about, about this format and why I chose to interact with things or interact with a live class using YouTube, right? Because one of them's obvious, and then there are a couple more that aren't as obvious. And then just go over a few announcements and talk about various things about the class before we get into our content today, which is the Module 1 History of Social Media Content. But basically what we're looking at here is, I like to do these initial streams through YouTube, a study done last year, although I do believe it was by YouTube, so, take it with a grain of salt. A study done by YouTube. Essentially, they put out a survey. 80% of survey respondents said they come to YouTube first whenever they're trying to learn something. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot in this course is trying to figure out who your user base is and then going to your user base where they are, right? Kind of figure out who is interested in what you have to say, or, let's face it, a lot of social media is business social media and kind of marketing and sales focused. So, whoever's interested in what you have to say or whoever's interested in what you have to sell, right? Kind of finding out where they are and then going to them with your message. And so considering the fact that, 80% of people come to YouTube to learn something new, I figure that a lot of people are probably accustomed to coming to YouTube to learn stuff. And the platform is very familiar, and it's something that we're kind of used to and we know about. So that's one of the reasons why I like to use YouTube for these live class sessions. Another big reason is that I think they provide us with the ability to do some interaction without it being too high stakes, right? Too big time, or for lack of a better word, right? Because like when you're in class, you're face to face. I know various people have various anxieties, although, in this class we have to, we're kind of tiptoeing around those. We'll talk about that more in just a second. You have various levels of comfortability, if you will, interacting and, raising your hand in class to ask a question, for example. And, based on that, I kind of like to make interaction lower stakes if at all possible. So in this sort of format, it's sort of a one-to-many sort of format primarily, whereas, I'm the one with, the control of the screen. I'm the one with the microphone. But you still all have the ability to interact and ask questions. That's what the chat is there for. If you have a question, you can just type it into the chat. I will see it. I do monitor the chat. I might not see it right away, because especially when I'm getting on a big kick about one thing or another, I get a little tunnel vision, but I will go back to the chat and answer that question, even if I don't see it right away. So you don't have to worry about your microphone accidentally being on. You don't have to worry about your camera accidentally being on. You don't even necessarily have to speak up to ask a question. you can just type it into that box and we'll answer it. And so with that being said, I'd like to talk just a couple minutes now about some of the course things, because I've got some questions about the course long project, which is the final project here. And that is, I want you to use the social media, right? I'd like for you to have a primary platform, and I'd like for you to have, some secondary platforms that point people to that primary platform. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I don't want you to do things or share things that would be outside of your realm of what you would be willing to do, right? Like one of the big things that we want to understand, especially about personal social media, is this idea of comfort level and what we're comfortable sharing and what we're not comfortable sharing. And that's why I kind of make that project such a wide, broad spectrum, right? Like, you don't have to be on camera. You don't really even have to say anything if you don't want to. You can just kind of, show some pictures and text with some music behind it, or however you want to approach the videos. And, that could be what you put online. Right. One of the things that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes, as we're looking at the history of social media and how social media has kind of grown, is that video engagement is one of the biggest levels of engagement right now, which is why I want a video platform to be kind of your primary platform. So do we have a tutorial on how to set up a Twitch channel? I don't yet, Kenneth, but I can make one. We can definitely do that. So I will make you one for that, and I'll stick it in the YouTube 101 module as soon as I get that made. So that's a good question, and I'll do that for you, and I'll put it in there as soon as I possibly can. That brings another thing up that I want to kind of talk about too, which I'll go ahead and mention it since we're on that. Yes, sir, will do. That brings another thing up here too that I kind of want to talk about is, the course is kind of designed from a broad perspective. So, with the understanding that some people this is second nature to them because, it's something that they do all the time regularly anyway. And then some people, all of this is brand new to. So I don't really know what people know and what people don't know. So throughout the semester, if you have questions like that, like how do we set this up or how do we do this, let me know and I'll add them to our knowledge base there in that YouTube 101 section. And we'll get that for you as quickly as possible. But kind of going back to what I was saying before, I want you to kind of stay within a comfort level. I don't want you to have to share any more than you're willing to share. Of course, we want to make sure everybody's comfortable. We don't want the class to distress anyone. And so I would also be open to like alternate possibilities. If you have an idea that you think might work better for something that you're interested in, that would be kind of similar in scope to the size of the project that we're kind of looking at, then when you are submitting your proposal, that's kind of what the proposal's for. Like, it's in this sort of regimented format, but, if you have something alternative that you want to propose that you think might be a good idea that you want to try, you're welcome to propose that as well. And, we can work something different out. So, that's kind of we kind of have an outline of a project there, but it's not necessarily written in stone, right? Like, it can be adjusted and it can be worked with on an individual basis if you have some ideas that you're wanting to try as well. So that's another big thing there that I kind of want to bring up today, is we don't want you to get upset by this. And if you've got other ideas that aren't necessarily like strictly in line with, kind of the project, but it's kind of similar, I want to hear it, and, we can work that out. And so that's where we're at with that. So I think that's all the announcements that I want to cover for today. So now we can kind of move right into the material. And we're talking about the history of social media this week. You know, that's one of the things that I kind of like for us to start off with. It's one of the things that I like to start off with in a lot of my intro level classes is just the history of whatever it is that we're talking about. This gives you sort of some insight about how things have grown and progressed and gotten to kind of where they are now, so we can have this basic understanding of kind of where we were and how that's built to where we are. And so that's kind of what we're going to look at. We're going to look at some of the earliest times of social media by our definition that we'll be using here. And then we'll be looking more specifically about social media over the last 30 years. So the first thing that we probably want to do here is we probably want to define social media. And so in doing so, one of the things that I kind of want to do is just go to the people who do all the definitions. And in this case, that's the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So according to Merriam-Webster, right, social media is defined as forms of electronic communication, such as websites for social networking and microblogging, through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, personal messages, and other content, like videos, right? So there are some key things that we want to pull out of this, right? Because essentially here what we have as the latter half of this definition, right? The online communication really specifically is something that's kind of been added later. Right? We have this idea of online communities. Online communities can't really exist until the year 1994. But when we look at the first half of this statement, where we're examining here forms of electronic communication. Forms of electronic communication have been around for a long, long time. And so when we're thinking about the history of social media, we're thinking about the history of social media through the lens of this definition, right? And so we can kind of break this definition down into its parts, being forms of electronic communication, and how electronic communication has kind of hybridized and changed over time to be what we know it as today. The idea of online communities, websites, things of that nature. Right? So we can take this definition and we can apply it differently, and we can apply it to social media in times even before the internet. Right? So if we're thinking about social media in that sort of way, we can think about it as being something that, you know, started out before the internet. Because in certain senses, right, social media started with that electronic communication. When we were able to start that electronic communication, that gave us social media, according to that definition. It's just how electronic communications changed, right? So May 24th, 1844, we have the invention of the telegraph, which, you know, the very first message, what hath God wrought, being tapped out by dots and dashes. And that's the first time that we ever really encountered electronic communication that allowed people to to interact with one another. Right now, obviously, we're not tapping out communication today on telegraphs, and that's a good thing. But when we kind of look at the idea of the telegraph here, to get a little more technical with it, when we look at the idea of the telegraph's not actually that different than the way we communicate electronically with computers today, right? Because when we look at the dots and the dashes, we either have a sound or we don't, right? It's either a sound or a silence. And when we kind of put that in relationship to what we know today about electronic computer-based messages, well, kind of similar to binary, huh? Like when we take everything that our computer ingests and understands and then spits back out to us, the computer's reading all of that and interacting all of that with all of that through binary. So, text, pictures, videos, everything is getting converted to a series of ones and zeros that the computer can understand. And really these ones and zeros are just electrical impulses, times when, there's electricity going to a certain point or when there's not electricity going to a certain point. And we can make this sort of connection, right? Albeit maybe a leap. We can make this sort of connection with these ones and zeros, with this binary and the way that our computer communicates all the way back to the way Samuel Morse was dealing with the telegraph back in the 1840s. And if we look at this story even further, right, we're kind of talking about the telegraph as the earliest thing. When we look deeper into the idea of the telegraph, there was even telegraph shorthand, right? Because you had to interpret the things that were going on with, the dots and the dashes that were getting sent across the line. So they came up with an idea of a shorthand to be able to communicate with people. So even that, right, is not that far of a stretch from the modern LOLs and OMGs that we've kind of developed today. And a lot of that came out of like the teletype, the TT9 or whatever, from back in the, before we had full keyboard smartphones. So we see this progression of kind of the way that electronic communication started and the way that it is today, really, if we break it down, isn't that much different. But now we wouldn't start to see what we would know as more modern electronic communication until the 1960s. Right? So we've gone from the 1840s. The telegraph kind of leads into the telephone. So we have this, telephone system, especially like the early telephone system. Like if you saw the little cartoon that I ran pre-stream this morning, that's a telephone switchboard from an old public domain cartoon, which I like to put there just because I think it looks kind of neat. We have this kind of progression of communication from the telegraph onto the telephone, but the next real big point of electronic communication happened in the 1960s, the late 1960s, with ARPANET, and this would be basically the precursor to the modern internet. ARPANET was something that was created by the DoD, the Department of Defense, and in fact a specific division of the DoD, ARPA, specifically, Advanced Process... I can't remember the acronym right offhand. Let me just look that up really quickly. Advanced Research Projects Agency, yes. All the words were right there, just the way that they should be said wasn't quite there. So ARPANET and ARPANET's researchers, at that time it was primarily universities that were doing research for the military, right? The Department of Defense. And so they wanted to create a way that we could kind of electronically share information from one research institution to another research institution. So we got this ARPANET project started. And they developed the backbone there of what would be the modern internet. A lot of the internet protocols that we still use today, things like TCP/IP. were developed via ARPANET here. The very first application built for ARPANET was email, which we still use today. So we're using this sort of electronic communication to send data back and forth over the span of the next 10 years. ARPANET would grow exponentially. It would go overseas. And, this was a huge deal, right? Like, it would mean that, people in California could talk to people in, different parts of Europe and send them near instant electronic communication. So we can still kind of see this kind of growing in this same vein from the telegraph, right? Because you could run a telegraph wire a fairly long way and get those signals across the wire. Now we're just changing those dots and dashes to ones and zeros, and we're just running them along a long wire to be able to get communication from one point to another. And so we see ARPANET growing in these late 60s, 70s, 80s. In the 80s, it kind of got fragmented because, you got all these different sections that have all these different privacy rules. We kind of break off into subnets where, we only have the people who have the right clearance on this network to be able to get this certain information. So ARPANET was kind of fragmenting, and there were newer technologies kind of getting involved in this situation. And so in the early 1990s, ARPANET gets declassified, which then allows it to be picked up by other organizations to kind of build the backbone, build the infrastructure for the internet. And really, when we talk about the history of the internet, for example, we look at that event alongside of what was going on at CERN in the early 80s with Tim Berners-Lee. And that's where they were basically developing the software side of the internet, HTTP, HTML. All of those things come out of special projects at CERN to create websites and share digital images on websites. And that just so happened to get put into the public domain at roughly the same time that the ARPANET data got put into the public domain, or the infrastructure, the data behind the construction of ARPANET, rather, got put into the public domain. So we're able to take the Special Projects Office from CERN, that information, put it along with ARPANET, and that gives us the modern internet, the internet as we know it, or at least as we knew it back in the mid-90s, right? Still kind of dealing with dial-up baud modems back then. But this is kind of our progression of digital communication or electronic communication. So if we say in our definition that social media is based around electronic communication, we can see electronic communication building over time from as far back as 1844 with our telegraph. And we still have it today, and we still see it today growing and changing and becoming different right before our very eyes, right? We're just now within the last 6 months being inundated with what people think is going to be the next thing that's going to change digital communication, which we'll talk about at the end today. And so we move from this idea of the electronic communication growing and changing, and we move into the concept of the first social sites. And so these are, this is a list here of kind of our first social sites. These are sites that don't really exist anymore. Right, and we see all of these come kind of growing out of the growth in electronic communication, the advent of the modern internet. really when we look at the internet's growth in general and how these sites were kind of able to come about, we can put that alongside of online communication services. Right? So more access to the internet gave us more opportunities to interact with people on the internet, right? Like we started to see things like CompuServe and America Online and Prodigy. You could go to the grocery store and they'd have the little CD hanging there to where you could get, 500 free hours of America Online. This introduced people as a whole to the idea of digital communication. And we first kind of saw it through the idea of news groups. And a news group was essentially kind of like a bulletin board, but on the internet. Right? People could make posts and people could go on to these posts and make comments and share information and share files and do various things on these news groups. And, by and large, we kind of consider the news groups to be sort of a precursor to the modern forum. One, and two, they were a really different environment than what we kind of experience in social media now. Just because, news groups kind of, the technology for the news group was really a general internet technology, right? We saw it in the 80s and early 90s, but remember that at that time, the internet was not really a public thing. It was primarily at universities and things of that nature, research facilities, certain business and industries. And so you would have a group of similar individuals getting onto these news groups and interacting with one another. University professors, professional business people, sort of thing. Where there was a lot of emphasis sort of placed on the idea of professionalism. Right? Like if you go back and look at a lot of newsgroup threads, even newsgroup threads, as they progressed into the public internet era, we didn't really see a whole lot of what we would now know as like flame wars and trolling and all this kind of stuff, because we had a limited group of like-minded individuals, even when it became public, right? Because not everybody jumped on the internet right when it started in the 1994, 1995. All of that stuff that we kind of associate with social media nowadays and sort of the negative side of social media wasn't really a thing. Which is kind of interesting to think about it from that perspective, how we started with a more civil platform and got to kind of where we are now. And then we started to see more like social media dedicated sites, right? The first one was 6 Degrees. And it was more of a profile uploading service, right? Like you could make connections to other people because it was kind of based off of the whole, 6 degrees of separation thing, that everybody can be connected to somebody else within 6 steps. So you could create a profile and you could connect to other people, but there wasn't really the interaction like we would know it today, right? Like you're not really posting, you're not really directly interacting with other people. It's just a profile creation and then a connection, like essentially you're linking to other people's profiles that you know. And so we saw this in 1997. So it's kind of interesting to think about how really the first dedicated social site came about in 1997. And really, it gets kind of interesting that we see, I have the more popular today social media platforms on the next slide. And it's actually kind of incredible to think about how old some of these platforms are. We don't really think about it, but they've been around a lot longer than it seems like. So our first dedicated social site, the way that we could look at it, was 6 Degrees in 1997. And then in 2001, we got our first major social site that would be more similar to what we would know as a modern social site, and that was Friendster. Still pretty rudimentary. But at this point, we're getting millions of people online and doing basic online networking. All right, and another thing to kind of point out here, during this time period, right, the late 90s, the early 2000s, some of you might remember that time period as the dot-com boom, leading up to the subsequent dot-com bust. Right, so we saw a lot of kind of similar things during this time. So we saw a lot of things that were 6 degrees like that were popping up around that time, a little later. We saw a lot of things that were Friendster like around that time that were popping up. Just because, we had this, this is the time of the virtual gold rush, the dot-com boom, where everybody is trying to just throw money at online business because it's the thing. It's what's happening, right? And if we can get into it now, we can get into it on the ground floor and we can make a ton of money. So we saw a lot of similar sites and we saw a lot of kind of clones here. So, there are other things that you could hear as being like major sites at the time. But, these are kind of the things that we see pulled out of it. And we can kind of pinpoint 6 degrees, and Friendster and LiveJournal subsequently are things that are still talked about today. For example, LiveJournal was kind of the first easily available blogging platform, and it was created in 1999. We'll talk more about what a blog is in Module 2, right? Kind of the format of a blog. But essentially, it's a one-to-many sort of communication method where everything is posted via text. And so what we see there is we see this ability to communicate with the masses. And one of the big things about LiveJournal here is that it wasn't just a blogging platform. Right? Because there were blogging platforms that if you had some technical knowledge, you could set up yourself on a server and kind of work with. But with LiveJournal, you could just go create an account and they would provide you with an interface for a blog. Right? So from LiveJournal, we saw things like blogger.com and all these other things pop up. And this was probably one of the first big internet acquisitions as well. Like nowadays, it's nothing to hear about an acquisition online, of a company getting bought for billions of dollars because, some other bigger company kind of liked what they were doing. We could probably see that as one of the first big examples of this when Google purchased LiveJournal in 2003. So that's kind of why I have them in this order here, even though technically, LiveJournal came before Friendster in that sort of timeline of creation. LiveJournal became big when it was bought by Google in 2003, and all of these social sites, kind of in the dot-com boom, kind of pushed their way in. Now, as we know that with every boom, there's also a bust, right? So in around, 2002, 2003, 2004, we were kind of seeing the dot-com bust at those times. We saw people throwing in good money after bad money into online investments. Everybody was just trying to create an online service product just to kind of throw it at the wall and see if it stuck. And a lot of them didn't stick. And a lot of people lost a lot of money during this time period. But one of the things that kind of came out of this was the idea of social media being sort of the next big thing. because we saw its popularity here from 6 Degrees, from Friendster, from LiveJournal, these platforms that we don't really hear of anymore. And it kind of ushered in this era of what we would call Web 2.0. When we're talking about Web 2.0, we're talking about the integration of essentially social media into the internet, which we don't even really think about that anymore because it's sort of omnipresent now, right? Like, as this was starting to come in, we would see like, oh, this place has a page on this site, and this place has a page on this site. That's kind of interesting. And now, like, there are other sites that we log into with our Facebook account, right? So, like, social media and, like, social media tracking, which is kind of interesting to talk about. We'll talk about that more in depth in a future live session, the idea of tracking. But a lot of the ways, like, when you see, like, when you think your phone's listening to you, that sort of thing, a lot of what's happening there, sometimes it might be, but a lot of what's happening there is that when you're browsing on other sites, even sites that seemingly have nothing to do with these larger platforms like Facebook, right? And Facebook and Instagram are the same company. They'll have tracking on their site that sends data back to Facebook, because, you know, that's one of the things that we'll kind of talk about in the future is that, you know, when they're not selling you a product, you probably are the product. So it's something that we want to be mindful of. But, you know, we'll talk about that in a later module. But all of that is to say that, you know, essentially social media has kind of been ingrained into every aspect of the internet nowadays, which, you know, it is essentially Web 2.0 in terms of how we would talk about that. And so moving on from there, I'd just like to talk about, you know, some of the, you know, I said the next slide is going to be the, you know, the big ones, right? And it's the majority of the big ones. Here we have them. And so these are the creation dates or the foundation dates of what we would consider to be some of the largest social media platforms out there today. I don't have Snapchat on here, which would be another one. But I think I do have it in my notes here, so I'll check that in just a moment. I want to say that's 2011. But we'll check my notes here in just a minute, just to verify that. But one of the things that we mentioned there was that, you know, a lot of these big social media sites that we know nowadays, they started a lot earlier than we think, and really the biggest one that's still around is LinkedIn, right? And it started in 2002. And if you don't know about LinkedIn, you know, you probably should, right? LinkedIn was designed as a social media site specifically for career-minded people, professionals, right? People looking for jobs, people who have jobs to give, basically. And so we see it starting here in 2002. And, you know, the numbers for how many people are on these platforms are all over the place because, you know, you get numbers from different time periods and you say, well, this many people was on the platform at this time. This many people was on the platform at that time, right? So by 2020, right, so we're looking at an 18-year span here, 675 million users worldwide on LinkedIn. And it's still the social media of choice for job seekers and human resources managers, you know, people who are hiring people. Right, but the way that you would interact on LinkedIn obviously is quite different than than the way you'd interact on Facebook. MySpace in 2003, MySpace has kind of gone away nowadays. But it was at one time one of the biggest, well, I'd say one of, but it was the biggest social media platform in the entire world. Right, back in 2006, 2007, you were a nobody if you weren't on MySpace. Facebook came around in 2004. A lot of the history of Facebook is kind of documented in that film, The Social Network, right? And it's kind of interesting to think about the history of Facebook from where it started to where it's at now, because it started incredibly small. When you kind of look back at the history of Facebook in 2004, it was just a platform for students at Harvard. Like you hear the kind of joke that it was like, well, Mark Zuckerberg made this site because, he was trying to get a date. And so he had to figure out a way to, kind of interact with people and make connections here. So he came up with Facebook. And at first it was just for students at Harvard, along with Zuckerberg back in 2004. And then it was expanded to be, about a year or two later, it was expanded to be for anyone who was in a college or university. You had to be a student, but if you had a .edu email address, basically, you could have a Facebook profile. And that's when I got my first one, I think was around, it was late 2005, I think they opened it up for that. And I got my first one at that time as a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm sure that particular account is gone to the ether nowadays, just deleted. Just a series of ones and zeros out there in the memory stream. But then a couple years later, it was opened up to everybody in the world, which was really that was the catalyst to make Facebook, which is now known as Meta, the parent company. Facebook is still Facebook, but Facebook has a parent company, Meta, now, which is still the same people. That is just basically the evil corporation from every video game and movie you've ever seen. That's an international conglomerate. That's essentially what Meta is nowadays. Which is kind of interesting to think about where it started in 2004 to where it's at in 2022. YouTube, likewise. YouTube started out as an independent website. We're on YouTube right now. Like you can actually still watch the very first YouTube video, which was put up on the day the site was launched back in April of 2004 or 2005 rather. It is called Me at the Zoo. You can go on YouTube. You can find that video. It's about 15, 16 seconds long, and it's just one of the founders at the zoo. You can't quite put up a video website without a video on it. But this was the catalyst for a big shift in video for the web in general and video for social media. Because prior to this point, if you wanted to put videos online, you either had to have a special connection with another site that was basically, made their money by content farming. So it would have to be a good video, basically, an interesting video. So you could, share them with like the E-Bombs Worlds and the Liquid Generations of the day. And they would put the video on their site and it would basically be hosted on the platform. So if you wanted to do self-hosted videos prior to YouTube, or self-published videos prior to YouTube, you'd again have to have a server with the storage space and the technical knowledge to host the videos, to host and show the videos. But YouTube takes the idea of sharing online videos and makes it incredibly simple, right? And they were one of the first ones to really do that. Back in 2005, a few years later, Google would see the value of YouTube, just like they saw the value of LiveJournal back in 2003, and they'd buy YouTube for a nice chunk of change. And that eventually got us to what we know YouTube as today, the international sensation. Reddit, 2005. Some of you might not be familiar with Reddit. Reddit's, basically a forum. If we kind of remember forums from back in the early 2000s, those earlier days of the internet, the ability to share text posts and things like that. Reddit is kind of the evolution of that to the next level. Interesting. We'll talk about what Reddit is a little more in depth when we get there. Twitter kind of has an interesting story because before it was the social media platform that we know today that everybody loves to hate. The original idea of Twitter came about because one of the devs, one of the people that were making the site, loved to go to raves. And one of the problems that they had at the raves were that, they'd lose their friends and they couldn't find them. So they wanted to come up with a quick and easy way to be able to broadcast a message to all of the friends that they came to the party with so that they could all meet back up at a certain point. And that evolved into what we know today as Twitter, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. So the early Twitter actually started 2006, which especially for those of the younger among you, that might be new information for you. Instagram came out in 2010. Let me check my notes here for that Snapchat date I was talking about there. Yep, Snapchat 2011. And these are two of the first services that kind of prioritized multimedia as the primary form of communication on them. Instagram and Snapchat. Instagram for photos, Snapchat for videos, Instagram later for photos as well, as they kind of try to move in on Snapchat's turf. And both of them kind of evolved into what is the current behemoth of the social media world, which is TikTok. And TikTok's an interesting story. The TikTok social media app itself was created back in 2016. TikTok has a Chinese parent company by the name of ByteDance. And the app in 2016 was all well and good. But it didn't really take off until they merged with the US-based app Musical.ly in the year 2018. If you remember Vine, which, for some of us, how could we forget it? If you remember Vine was, around 2014 when it was created. I don't have a date in my notes for that. Maybe 2015. And Musical.ly kind of rose out of the death throes of Vine. And it actually became a relatively large platform that had a good code base. And so TikTok saw that and they said, hey, this could work fairly well for what we want to do, and we can work with that and use that. And that grew into what we know TikTok as today, which is absolutely enormous. Just some stats here that I find interesting. I found these in an article. 72% of U.S. adults. Now that's a key term there to examine, is the idea of adults, because when we think about some of these platforms, and it's something that we'll talk about, when we talk about finding our audience and working with our audience, when we think about some of these platforms, we kind of see them and think about them as the social media for children, right? Like by and large, nowadays, TikTok would be that platform where all the kids are at. right? 72% of U.S. adults, and I believe we're using adults here as ages 18 and older, use social media of some kind. And that's a big number, and that's only growing, right? Because like there was a time, not even that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, right, when you'd see like nobody older than 35 have social media profiles. But nowadays my 85-year-old grandmother has a Facebook profile, right? Like, it's kind of, since that Web 2.0, it's kind of ingrained itself into culture. We see more and more people creating profiles, getting involved in social media, because by and large, right, like, you want to be able to communicate. You want to be able to, I know a popular one with her over the last couple of years is that, you wanted to be able to access church services online. With the pandemic, you had a lot of churches broadcasting services to Facebook and YouTube in order to be able to get their message out. So that was one of the things that was big for her in terms of making decisions to get social media accounts, right? So she can go and watch and interact with those. So we see more and more adults and more older individuals registering for accounts and being active on social media. And 73% of adults say they regularly visit YouTube, right? Which is kind of a different number than that 80% we were talking about at the start of class when I said 80% of people go to YouTube to learn things. That's based on people that go to YouTube, that use YouTube. 80% of those identify one of their uses that they do as going to learn things, and that's where they go first. This is just people in general. 73% of U.S. adults regularly visit YouTube, which is even bigger than Facebook, right? Because we have Facebook there, and 69% of U.S. adults are on Facebook. Now, in a smaller demographic, adults 18 to 24, but still adults, 75% of them use Instagram. And Instagram, by and large, was the platform for younger people. But what we see with a lot of these platforms, and we talk about the age of the people who are using these platforms, is that the age of the user base kind of grows with the social media platform itself, right? Because like 5 years ago, we might have said that Instagram's primarily people 16 to 21. Right? But then 5 years pass, and the people that have Instagram ingrained as part of their lives, well, they're still using Instagram. But now they're 24. 25, right? So we see this idea of kind of the platform growing with people and the platform kind of pushing forward, and then something new coming along like TikTok to kind of scoop up the younger people that are looking for a certain social media platform, a certain way to connect. And then we have here 73% of U.S. adults use Snapchat, which is interesting. One of the things that we'll talk about in a future module is kind of the ephemeral nature of Snapchat and what the appeal of that is. So hang on to your hats for that one. But as we kind of wrap up today, and we're getting toward the end here, I like to kind of leave with what's next. So that's kind of the last slide that we have here, is what's next. And my first 3 bullet points here are kind of things that we kind of have already looked at, right? These came, the first 3 bullet points here came out of an article. Let me check my notes here from when this article was from. It came out of an article from Entrepreneur Magazine from 2017. So it's a 5-year-old article that gave us these first 3 bullet points here. This article was called 11 Ways Social Media Will Evolve in the Future. And this was one of those speculative articles that you see people write from time to time, thinking about what forms and how things will change. And they were looking at the idea of highly personalized content, which is 100% happening. Right? Personalized to a granular level. And a lot of this comes as a result nowadays from all of the off-site tracking that's done by a lot of these major social media corporations. Like, sites that are unrelated to Facebook will have Facebook trackers on them. YouTube, which is a part of Google's parent company, Alphabet now. They get access to all of that search data for granular tracking, and it's all kind of connected to your Gmail handle if you're logged into Gmail, which you would also need to be able to log into YouTube, right? And a lot of the big design for this is to be able to pull out this highly personalized content, but at the same time, there are some drawbacks. There are some major drawbacks to this, which we will talk about in future modules. That cause some issues and maybe some alarm there. But maybe they wouldn't cause so much alarm if we were to lean into the second bullet point here, which is an increased focus on privacy. And this isn't necessarily something that we've really seen yet. Don't really know how many companies, how many individuals are really leaning into this idea. But it is something that people are kind of demanding, so maybe we will see more of that in the near future, fingers crossed. Taking greater advantage of mobile devices. And this is something we've seen, and we've seen a lot of it, right? The majority of people that interact with a site nowadays are interacting via mobile. You might be watching this right now via some kind of mobile device, phone, tablet, something like that. Right? So, there is that. And so we can take mobile apps and we can make a mobile app experience that is better than what a browser experience might be like, because the majority of people are utilizing mobile devices to interface with what we're doing. It all kind of goes back to that idea that, again, we'll talk about later in the course, where we want to go to the people that we want to connect with where they're at. And if that's on a mobile device, we need to make a great experience for the mobile device. And that's definitely happening. And I want to kind of wrap up here just talking for a few minutes about something that's really gotten into the zeitgeist within the last, I'd say, 6 months, which is the idea of the Metaverse. So this is sort of a brand new thing that, really is only coming to the collective consciousness recently. And when we think about, the way people are describing the Metaverse nowadays, it kind of conjures up these images of like the Ready Player One, right? Where you have the, what do they call it in Ready Player One? My mind is leaving me right now. But the place where they enter into the virtual reality and they can just kind of hang out and play, and some of you will know what I'm talking about, and others of you will not. If you've seen the movie or read the book there, then you'll know. But it's this idea of kind of of introducing social media into VR for an overly simplified explanation of that. And so we take interactions that would happen in the world, we take property that would exist in the world, and we put it into a VR space, and we see the preparations for a lot of that happening now, and there is some social issues that brings up, and there are some ethical ramifications to this idea. And I think for some of that, we'll only see more as it kind of progresses, because there are a lot of people who seem to be adamant about the Metaverse or Web 3.0 coming into existence. And, along with this, we see a lot of other technologies that are kind of controversial at the moment. Blockchain, smart contracts, cryptocurrencies kind of being placed alongside the idea of the metaverse, right? Because if your interaction is going to be virtual and your property is going to be virtual, your currency and how you make deals might as well be virtual as well. And so there is a lot of controversy there in this space. And I think later on in the semester, one of the things that I would like to do is just to dedicate an entire live virtual class to this idea of the metaverse and kind of where we're going from here. But, I almost kind of think a little more just needs to unfold before I can get my head wrapped around everything well enough to talk about it at length. And so I don't like these live virtual classes to go much longer than an hour. About an hour 15, if necessary, is going to be the absolute upper limit. So this is where we're going to stop for today. If you're watching the recording of this later and you have questions, feel free to email or Teams message me. For those of you who are here with me live, I'm going to put the music back on for just a couple more minutes and just kind of hang out in the chat and answer questions if you have any. But that's all that I have for you for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.